Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. This time we're tackling this ceasefire that just came out between Israel and Hezbollah up in Lebanon. We've been digging through a ton of news reports, and international reactions, even some really in-depth analysis pieces, really trying to get to the bottom of what this ceasefire actually means, like who are the big players and how's this going to shake things up in the whole region long term. So you're ready to get into it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And one thing that really jumps out at me right off the bat is how this 60-day transition period is set up, especially with Israeli forces pulling back. It kind of reminds me of what Israel tried back in 2000, that whole step-by-step withdrawal thing. But things went kind of sideways back then. Hezbollah, I think, supposedly broke the agreement, and the whole conflict just flared up again. So the big question now is, like, how's this ceasefire going to try to avoid making those same mistakes again?
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like we're kind of seeing history repeat itself here a bit.
Mhm.
So are there any like safeguards this time to try and stop that from happening?
Well, they are bringing in a pretty serious international task force to keep an eye on things. It's going to be led by the U.S., but they'll have French peacekeepers in there too. And it's not just, a symbolic thing.
Yeah.
They're really serious about making sure both sides actually stick to the agreement.
Okay, that's interesting. But going through all these reports, it seems like there's already some disagreement on what sticking to it actually means, Especially when we're talking about Israel's right to respond if they feel threatened.
Yeah, that whole freedom of action debate. Netanyahu's saying Israel keeps the right to hit back against Hezbollah no matter what. But then you got U.S. officials saying, hold on a sec. They're basically saying Israel can only act on their own if there's a threat right now, like this second.
Hmm.
Anything less than that, and they got to talk to the U.S. first and prove that the Lebanese army can't handle it.
So it's like a recipe for disaster, basically.
Yeah.
Because what Israel sees as a threat and what the U.S. thinks is okay to respond to could be two totally different things. And let's face it, history hasn't exactly shown Hezbollah to be the best at keeping their promises either.
That's a good point. There's this report here that caught my eye. Seems like Hezbollah started moving some of their artillery, which is, part of the deal. But then some satellite images are showing some things that don't quite add up. Makes you wonder what they're really up to, doesn't it?
For sure. It's like this whole ceasefire is one giant chess game with every single move having these huge consequences.
Hmm.
Speaking of moves, Netanyahu actually came out and said why he agreed to this thing. And I got to say, I'm a little skeptical.
Oh, what's making you raise an eyebrow?
Well, he says Israel needs to shift its focus to Iran, calling them the biggest threat. He says by taking a breather in Lebanon, they can really focus on stopping Iran's influence and their, nuclear stuff. But honestly, it also feels a bit like he's trying to distract everyone from all the problems he's got back home.
Yeah, that's something to think about for sure. It's tough to separate, internal politics from what's going on internationally, especially in a place as complicated as this.
Exactly. And then there's his second reason, getting the Israeli forces and all their weapons back in shape. He's admitting they've had delays in supplies, maybe because of the war in Gaza. So this ceasefire gives them time to restock and get ready for whatever's next. But is that the whole story? Or could this also be a way to kind of isolate Hamas down in Gaza?
Now that you mention it, Netanyahu did say he thinks this is going to weaken Hamas because Hezbollah won't be able to join their fight anymore, supposedly. He's hoping it'll force Hamas to the table and get those hostages back. Which brings us to the Lebanese side of things. This whole conflict has absolutely devastated their country. Over 3,768 people killed, almost 16,000 hurt, and almost 1 million people displaced. Those numbers are just unbelievable.
That's heartbreaking. No wonder their government's happy about the ceasefire. They're desperate for some stability,
Yeah.
a chance to rebuild.
Right. Their main goal is getting their people back home and starting that long road to recovery. But there's this underlying tension, isn't there? I mean, the Lebanese people have seen this before. Promises of peace that just fall apart. How does this ceasefire really deal with that, that deep distrust and weariness they feel?
I think you've hit on something really important there.
Yeah.
It's not just about what's written down in the agreement. It's about what the people who are actually living through this have gone through, especially when you think about Hezbollah's role in all of this. They agreed to the terms, but sources are saying they see it more as a tactical pause, not like a real solution, a way to protect their people.
Yeah, but also their weapons.
Exactly. It makes you wonder if maybe Hezbollah is realizing the human cost is just getting too high. Maybe they're looking for a way out, at least for now, but still trying to keep up their image as, the defenders of Lebanon. That's a really interesting way to look at it.
Yeah.
Kind of flips the script on how we usually see them, doesn't it? So here we are with this ceasefire that's full of these conflicting motives and all this baggage from the past and just a whole lot of uncertainty hanging over it. What does this all mean for the bigger picture. Where does the war in Gaza fit into all this, and is there even a tiny chance this could actually lead to real peace?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, and it's one we're going to dig into even more as we go deeper into the details of this agreement and, all the potential roadblocks we might hit. But one thing to remember is this situation is constantly changing. Lots of moving pieces and players involved, so buckle up because this deep dive's about to get even more interesting.
Everyone hold on tight. We're just getting started.
Yeah.
All right, so we've talked about the big picture stuff, but let's zoom in on some of the specifics of this ceasefire agreement, because it's not just about, stopping the fighting, right? There's actual stuff they got to do that we need to understand.
Yeah, exactly. It's a pretty complicated document with a lot going on. One thing that stands out is that Hezbollah has to move all their heavy weapons north of this Litani River. The idea is to create a buffer zone, so things don't flare up again right away. But here's the catch. They don't say anything about disarming.
So they can basically keep all their weapons, they just got to move them a little bit. That doesn't exactly sound like a recipe for long-term peace, especially since Israel sees those weapons as a direct threat to their, existence.
It's definitely a point of contention. And you have to wonder, will Hezbollah actually do it? I mean, they don't exactly have the best track record when it comes to following these international agreements.
And even if they do move the weapons,
yeah,
what's to stop them from just building up their stockpiles again during this ceasefire? Seems like a temporary fix at best.
That's a concern a lot of analysts are bringing up. If Hezbollah sees this as a tactical pause, a chance to regroup and rearm, then the underlying issues aren't really going away. And then what happens after those 60 days are up?
Exactly. That's what I keep coming back to. What's in place to make sure things don't just explode again once that transition period is over? It seems like a lot is riding on the Lebanese army being able to step in and control the south. But from what I'm reading, they're facing some pretty serious challenges.
Oh, yeah, they are. They're just not as well equipped or as experienced as the Israeli military. And don't forget about Hezbollah's influence in Lebanese politics. They've got a lot of power in the government, so who knows how willing they'll be to let the army actually control the south, even if it's just on paper.
So you're saying that even if this ceasefire does give everyone a little breathing room, the long-term success really comes down to politics more than military strategy.
Exactly. If Hezbollah isn't truly on board with this agreement, if they see it as just a temporary setback and not a real step toward peace, then it's probably going to fall apart.
And even if Hezbollah does cooperate, we still have to think about Israel's intentions. Netanyahu's insisting they have the right to respond with force to any threat they see from Hezbollah, even after the ceasefire is in place. That seems like a pretty big red flag.
It is, and it's already causing some tension between Israel and the U.S. The Americans are saying any response to threats that aren't happening right this second has to be coordinated with them, and only if the Lebanese army can't handle it. There's a lot of room for misinterpretation and miscalculation there.
It's like a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
Yeah.
What one side sees as defending themselves could easily look like a provocation to the other, and things could spiral out of control really fast. So let's talk about what's at stake here. What happens if the ceasefire collapses? What's the worst-case scenario?
Well, the most immediate thing would be more fighting, probably even worse than what we've seen these last few weeks. Both sides have shown they're willing to escalate things, and a lot more people could die. The humanitarian crisis in Lebanon would get even worse, with even more people displaced and suffering.
And it wouldn't just stay in Lebanon, would it? This kind of escalation could drag in other countries in the region, potentially starting a full-blown regional war. Just thinking about that is terrifying.
It's a scary thought, for sure, and it really shows how important it is to find a way to peace that actually lasts. Even if the ceasefire holds, the question is what needs to happen to make it lead to real stability? What are the key things that need to happen for that to become reality?
That's something a lot of people are probably trying to figure out right now. Is it even possible to imagine a future where Israel and Hezbollah can actually coexist peacefully?
It's a tough challenge, that's for sure. But I think the first step is for both sides to actually show they really want peace. It can't just be a tactic, It has to be a real change in how they approach this conflict. They have to be willing to talk to each other, to make tough compromises, and to deal with the root causes of this whole mess that's been going on for decades.
That's a lot to ask. There's so much distrust and bad blood between them built up over all these years. How do you even start to bridge that kind of gap?
It's going to take a multi-pronged approach. Sustained diplomatic efforts, confidence-building measures, and a real willingness to actually listen to and understand the other side's complaints. And let's not forget, it's not just about Israel and Hezbollah. We got to think about the whole regional context, the role of Iran, Syria, Saudi Arabia, the U.S., and all the different Palestinian groups. They all have their own agendas and interests going on.
So real peace means more than just an agreement between two sides.
Yeah.
It needs a solution for the whole region, which, let's be honest, feels pretty far off right now. But just for the sake of argument, let's say this ceasefire does hold. What are some of the potential problems, the things that could make this fragile peace fall apart?
Yeah, those are some really tough questions, and honestly, we don't have any clear answers just yet. But one thing's for sure, what both sides do during this transition time is going to be super important. It'll determine whether this ceasefire has any chance of actually leading to, lasting peace.
So it's like we're all kind of holding our breath, watching and waiting to see if they actually follow through on what they said. And speaking of following through, another potential problem is the whole prisoner and hostage situation.
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge part of this, and it's tied directly to what's going on in Gaza. Remember, Hamas is still holding all those hostages, including Africans, and getting them back is a top priority.
And even though this Lebanon ceasefire doesn't directly deal with the Gaza conflict, it could still affect those negotiations, right?
It definitely could. Netanyahu seems to be gambling that by taking Hezbollah out of the equation, Israel can put more pressure on Hamas to make a deal and release those hostages. He's thinking that Hamas, now that they're on their own, will be more willing to negotiate.
But that's a risky move, isn't it? There's no guarantee Hamas will see it that way. They might feel even more trapped and dig in even harder. And in the meantime, you've got millions of Palestinians in Gaza suffering because of this war. They're running out of food, water, and medicine. Their infrastructure is destroyed. It's a humanitarian disaster.
It's a terrible situation for sure. The international community is pushing hard for a ceasefire in Gaza, too. But those talks have been incredibly difficult. There's just so much distrust on both sides and a long history of broken promises.
Doesn't paint a very optimistic picture, does it?
Yeah.
Are there any reasons to be hopeful at all? Any chance that this Lebanon ceasefire could actually create some momentum for a bigger solution, maybe even lasting peace in the region?
We gotta hold on to hope even when things look bad. Some analysts think this ceasefire could actually open a window for broader talks across the region. The idea is that if Israel and Hezbollah, with all their history, can find a way to at least exist together, then maybe other players in the region might start to rethink things too. Maybe it could even lead to talks between Israel and Hamas, for example.
That's a long shot, I know. But just imagine if it happened. A lasting peace would mean the end of the fighting, a chance for everyone to rebuild and heal, and the possibility of a better future for the whole region. It's a goal worth fighting for, even if it's going to be really hard.
It would take some incredible leadership, bold diplomacy, and a real commitment from everyone to break free from all the violence that's been plaguing this region for generations. And let's not forget how important the international community is. The U.S., France, and other powerful countries have a responsibility to help with the talks, provide humanitarian aid, and hold everyone accountable for their actions.
It's a team effort for sure, one that needs our attention, our critical thinking, and our hope for a better future. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the main takeaways for our listeners? What should they be watching for in the coming days and weeks?
The most important thing is to see how both sides actually put this ceasefire into practice. Are they serious about de-escalating, or are they just stalling for time, getting ready for the next round of fighting? What they do is going to matter a lot more than what they say.
We need to look past all the talk and focus on what's actually happening. Are Israeli troops really leaving southern Lebanon? Is the Lebanese army actually taking control? Is Hezbollah moving their heavy weapons? And are there any signs of progress on the hostage situation? Any new efforts to get a ceasefire in Gaza? Any secret talks going on that could lead to a breakthrough?
Those are all great questions to keep in mind as we move forward. And remember, peace isn't just about the absence of war. It's about justice, equality, and mutual respect. To get that kind of peace, everyone needs to change their attitudes, recognize our shared humanity, and be willing to build a future together.
A future where everyone can thrive and prosper without the threat of violence. That's the ultimate goal, and it's worth fighting for no matter how tough it gets. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with more insights as this story unfolds.